All right, well, thank you all for attending this webinar. Appreciate your involvement. The idea of what we're going to cover today, first we're going to kind of go over background of the LCT, everything we've completed to date and next steps, and then get into the more discussion stage of the webinar, talking about actually planning the outreach stage that we're beginning now. We'll cover our goals, identifying stakeholders, our strategy for conducting outreach, and some outreach material. So first, kind of background section, which will basically fairly quick presentation. So the goals of the original LCD were to create a conservation blueprint, strengthen links between conservation planning and between conservation delivery, and to develop spatial products that help actually guide habitat delivery in specific locations across the geography, and to facilitate cooperation between conservation partners, and to ensure the continued utility of the blueprint by meeting stakeholder needs. And throughout this whole process, we've tried to make it a participatory kind of thing to make sure we meet all these goals. And we think this outreach stage is going to further help us meet these goals and make sure that people know how to use the products and that there's a continued utility of it, and also to kind of help facilitate that cooperation between partners. So the scope of the project geographically were the watersheds of the San Antonio, Guadalupe, and Lower Colorado River. And that spans from the Edwards Plateau between San Antonio and Austin down to the Gulf between Corpus and Lake Jackson. And ecologically, the scope is only a subset of habitats in this region. So we're not looking at all land in this pilot geography here, but we are targeting a certain types of habitats. And these are relatively broadly defined habitats. So we have floodplain forests, freshwater wetlands, major rivers, rice agriculture, tallgrass prairie, and tidal wetlands. Tallgrass prairie is a good example of that broad definition we're using. It really pretty much means most grasslands in the area, with the exception of some of the southwestern grasslands that would be classified with some of the semi-desert shrublands instead of tallgrass prairie. But it's most of the potential grassland in the geography. Tidal wetlands is another one where we have a subclass of salty prairie that we included in both the tallgrass prairie and tidal wetland products. So this kind of transition zone, and there's also some mapping issues. So just keep that in mind that these are fairly broadly defined. So most of the products cover probably more terrain than you might expect to fit a stricter definition of some of these habitats. So the process we followed for this, we used open standards for the practice of conservation, basically just a standardized systematic approach to conservation planning. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's similar to other conservation planning systems that exist out there. And the basic idea is to work together to set a vision for your project, to identify conservation targets, set goals, identify threats and factors that contribute to those threats or could potentially mitigate to those threats. And you end up with a conceptual model over here. This is just a crop of, a clip of that conceptual model, not the entire thing, but just to kind of give you an idea of how it works. And then from there, you conduct a viability assessment where you identify ecological attributes that are really important to your conservation targets, to go ahead and have an idea of the current state of them, and to identify potential indicators for monitoring progress in their conservation into the future. And also so that you can develop, then all of this whole conceptual model is used as kind of a starting point for developing conservation strategies, so that you can make sure what you're planning to do to meet your conservation goals is actually going to be directly linked to one of these threats or one of the contributing factors, or to one of your conservation targets directly. So we went through this whole process, And while the end result for us is mostly creating this blueprint, which is largely a collection of spatial decision support tools, so we're not actually going to be implementing these conservation strategies on the ground, but we went through that process of fleshing some of those out in a workshop a little over a year ago to make sure that the spatial decision support tools that we're developing will actually meet the needs of people that are going to be conducting these kind of conservation strategies in the geography. And then things more directly linked to it, the viability assessment that we conducted feeds directly into the ecological integrity ratings we did. It translates very easily to the approach we use for the ecological integrity ratings, and I'll get more into that later. And our conservation targets, so the conservation targets, there was an original focus on these focal species here in this table. And so you can see how they're linked to each of the broadly defined habitats. And it's a tiered system where the tier 1 species are either considered higher priority or there's just more information about them. So we know we have more information about how to manage for them. Whereas tier 3 species, we tend to have less information about their ecological needs. And so there was an original emphasis on these focal species, but we wanted to make it a little more inclusive because we know not everyone agrees on all of this focal species. And also conservation managers on the ground, typically are managing more with the habitat in mind. That's what they're actually manipulating. So we chose the habitats themselves as the conservation targets. And a lot of the key ecological attributes we selected reflect the needs of these focal species, but we also included other attributes that might not reflect the needs of one of these particular species, but are clearly important to the overall ecological integrity of the habitats that we're trying to conserve. And like I said, this was a participatory effort. So we hired professional facilitators, and we also had some volunteer facilitators. And we started with a series of webinars with the technical review team. And then we had a stakeholder workshop in November 2017. We're going to invite a lot of people for a multi-day workshop and got feedback on the viability assessment and the threat rankings and the conceptual model that we had developed so far. And then also worked on these conservation strategies. And all of this was an effort to guide the development of the decision support tools we were making. And so after that, we created drafts of all of the decision support tools and released them to this same broader stakeholder group that we had identified, and had a fairly extensive review period where people could fill out a questionnaire and send it back to us, or we also hosted a couple of webinars for people to provide feedback that way. And there was lots of phone calls and emails outside of the webinars and everything. So we got a lot of feedback. We think it really helped us improve the final product. And so that's the results we have so far, these decision support tools. Some of you may have looked at them already. I included a link to the database insights. They're all uploaded there now and open to the public. And they are basically, so we have a series of support tools that are spatially explicit models that we developed using the environmental evaluation modeling system, which is a hierarchical fuzzy logic modeling system. And we use that viability assessment to develop ecological integrity ratings. And part of those ratings is a human development index. And then the ecological integrity ratings feed into our conservation action prioritization models. And we have 3 different outputs there: habitat protection, habitat maintenance, and habitat restoration. And this flowchart here is just an example of how the models are structured. So this is ecological integrity for tallgrass prairie. Human development here has its own whole series of inputs that are not shown, just to make this a little clearer. Habitat amount and connectivity. So these are patch size, percent landscape cover, percent cover within the 200-meter reporting units. That's the resolution basically of our outputs, that 200 meters. A lot of the data we're using as inputs are at finer scale resolution, like 10 or 30 meters, but the output is displayed at 200 meter pixels. And then we also have habitat quality, so habitat amount and connectivity and human development index, both those include inputs that are largely in the local area. So it's often a 1 kilometer radius, like percent landscape here. Whereas habitat quality is looking more at site level metrics. We're looking at site level woody cover, site level herbaceous composition, things like that. And you can see here where we have the focal species, and we have habitat suitability indices specifically for each species, but then we also have vegetation factors that apply to most of these species as well as other species as well. And we have different operators here. I don't want to get too into the details of the modeling, but these union operators are basically taking mean values, and while the OR operators are taking the highest value. So for focal species, any given land unit doesn't need to be ideal habitat for all of the focal species. As long as it's ideal habitat for one of the species, that should be taken into consideration in these ratings. So it just takes the highest value. And here's an example. I'm going to go through a couple examples of the outputs. So here's a kind of a snapshot of the ecological integrity of floodplain forests, kind of looking at the Columbia bottomlands here and the Colorado River and the Lavaca and Navidad rivers. And the ratings range from poor to very good. And those are reflecting the viability assessment that we did. So this is an open standards system of ratings here, where the big takeaway is that poor and fair basically mean that the condition is outside of the natural range of variability, whereas good and very good means it's within that natural range of variation. So one way of thinking of that is basically poor and fair habitat is not in an acceptable state in terms of your conservation goals and priorities, whereas good and very good habitat is in a so-called acceptable state. And these are based on thresholds that we identified through the series of webinars in the beginning and through outreach to species experts and things like that. And this is all in the documentation, which currently exists in a draft state on our planning website. And we're in the process of updating that to reflect all the changes we made after stakeholder feedback. Human Development Index is one of the subcomponents of ecological integrity ratings. And so this just gives you an example of what that looks like across the pilot geography. You can see where San Antonio, New Braunfels, and all that has really high human development. So the ecological integrity there is poor. And then there's a lot of impact across this coastal region kind of down here. And this is mostly from agriculture. And we do not include rice agriculture in the Human Development Index, since that's one of our conservation targets. We didn't really think it made any sense to include that as a negative impact in that sense. One thing that's lacking here is this doesn't take into account pastures. So that's just kind of a shortcoming of the current remote sensing technology in our geography. And it's probably something that's going to change in the near future. So that's something to be excited about in future products like this, just having a better sense of herbaceous vegetation in grasslands and rangelands. So we take those ecological integrity ratings and they feed into our conservation action prioritization models. And so one of those outputs is habitat protection ranking. And this is basically just identifying land for acquisition or establishment of easements. And I chose rivers here just to kind of show you a different take on our river models. Most of our river models, we're looking at each reach individually. And so we have ecological integrity ratings of the segments themselves, or maintenance or restoration rankings for the different segments. But for habitat protection, you're not going to just go buy a reach of river specifically. You're going to buy the land in the watershed adjacent to it. And there was also a discussion at the workshop about linking upland management and protection to the the rivers themselves. And so I thought this was a nice way of kind of making that link and identifying lands within the adjacent subwatersheds of all of our major rivers. And you'll see a lot of gaps here. Those gaps are basically just habitat that was not included in our project. So because these are partially based off the ecological integrity ratings of each of the habitats, we can't include habitat that we didn't develop ecological integrity ratings for in the first place. So ecological integrity of the terrestrial habitat as well as of the riverine habitat feeds into these rankings. And then we also have opportunity and threat rankings. And opportunity rankings include things like land cost, parcel density, and partner prioritization. So we have maps of all the different partner priority areas that exist in the geography. And the more of those priority areas that overlap any given land unit, the higher partner interest is how we gauge that. So it just increases the odds that you'd find another organization that you can work with to acquire land or protect it in one way or another. And then threat rankings, those are based off the assessment we did in the original planning. And so it includes things like water withdrawals, urban development, things like that. And some of these, and we have future projections on these changes in the landscape. And so we use those to assess threat rankings for these areas. And you'll see some of these things kind of break up between watersheds or counties. Some of the input data we use for identifying threats and opportunities are really only available at the county or subwatershed level. Then we have the management rankings, and these are broken up into two different types. So there's the maintenance rankings in blue and the restoration rankings in yellow to red. And the way these are separated is based on habitat quality. So instead of basing it on the overall ecological integrity ratings, we focused on the habitat quality ratings because the habitat quality is, like I was saying before, reflects the site level condition of the habitat. And when you're trying to plan habitat maintenance or restoration, you're probably focused on managing that site level, the site level characteristics of the vegetation or the soil or the hydrology. You're probably not going to go do anything that's going to impact human development or connectivity at that larger scale in terms of direct management or restoration. To the extent those things happen, it would be in the habitat protection efforts. And these include the same kind of inputs that are in the habitat protection rankings. There are some differences for management. The opportunity rankings don't include land costs because you're not actually trying to buy the land. Instead, we have incentive program participation. So we have data on participation in U.S. Fish and Texas Parks and Wildlife incentive programs, as well as participation in EQIP in terms of the relevant practices to any given habitat. And so, you know, acres that it's been applied on or number of participants that have implemented those practices. And we have that data at the subwatershed level. So that's pretty useful for kind of identifying general landowner interests, especially since we have so much private land here for trying to guide habitat management. Another difference is the restoration rankings don't include threat rankings. That habitat's already degraded, so we didn't think it made a whole lot of sense to include threat rankings. And then last but not least, we have subwatershed outputs. So everything else we've been looking at is that 200-meter reporting unit output. We also aggregated it to the subwatershed level and generated maps at that level. So when you look at any one of the products I just went over for any habitat, there's a layer that shows the overall protection or management rankings at the subwatershed level. And then there's also a separate product you can open that has all of the subwatershed rankings for all the different habitats and all the different management prioritization models all in one place, just the subwatershed outputs. I guess before we go on, does anyone have any questions about all that? That was a lot to just kind of blow through there. All right. Well, so next steps is, like I was saying, complete the revisions of the documentation, and then formally release the conservation blueprint. All these products are publicly available already on Databasin, but we haven't actually sent out an email alerting everyone to that yet. And we've held off on that because we're working on creating a new website that hopefully will be a little easier to navigate and just have all the information in one place, including links to the products on Databasin, as well as the updated documentation. And of course, the other big thing that's coming up next is stakeholder outreach. And so we're going to step into planning that. So first off, our goals for the outreach phase are to ensure that relevant stakeholders understand how to use the conservation blueprint and spatial products, to ground truth the efficacy of our models, basically to kind of test if the areas we're prioritizing are actually make sense. You know, when we're doing these targeted outreach meetings, we can let people look at the specific area they work on and are super familiar with, and see if, you know, we're totally off base or if things really make sense to them. It seems like the prioritizations that we're resulting in within their frame of reference really make sense or not, and we get feedback on that. And then also additional feedback on strengths and weaknesses in general. We got a lot of really good feedback in our review phase, so I don't think there's a whole lot we can do there that doesn't depend on just waiting on improvements on remote sensing technology and things like that, or new data coming out. But still, to gather more feedback on that would be helpful. And then also to promote cooperation between conservation partners and ensure complementarity with overlapping conservation design efforts. So there's other things like the SCA, and some other kind of conservation design spatial products being developed that have different total geographies but have some overlap. And so we've been talking to people already to make sure those are complementary, but to keep doing that. Oh, so I guess, do these goals make sense to everyone? Do these sound like the right goals for conducting outreach at this stage of the project after we've finished all the spatial products, or do you think we have a big blind spot here? There's something we're missing?
They seem reasonable to me.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, same here. I think it makes sense. One concern, I guess, with the quote unquote relevant stakeholders, just trying to determine who those stakeholders are. I know you have a stakeholder list, but if you really want the blueprint to inform actions on the ground, maybe trying to secure a partnership with a program within one of these organizations that's actually delivering projects on the ground there, where you could sort of demonstrate or pilot use of this tool as part of some conservation funding that they plan to put, to support projects on the ground over the next, 1, 2, 3 years, that sort of time frame.
All right, so actually like partner with someone that is actually putting conservation on the ground and use that as an example of the efficacy of our decision support tools, basically?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this was funded by Fish and Wildlife Service, and, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Service Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, they're investing in habitat restoration projects in areas all over the state. I can't speak to exactly what their investments are in this area. Ducks Unlimited is supporting projects. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is supporting projects. It would be good to zero in on one or more programs that might help walk this through actual, maybe a set of projects that are being considered for funding, maybe proposals, and use this tool to help inform selection I can think of examples of other LCC funded products that were used that way, and I think it takes it beyond the conceptual for stakeholders, because if you go into a situation, a workshop type setting, and you demo a tool like this and you encourage potential applications in these areas, it's really tough to get someone to grab on to that, a resource manager to take the tool and go use it, unless you have some more formal pilot project that's designed.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a whole ton of sense. Thank you for that.
This is Nancy. I agree. I think that's a really good idea. And I'm also a little bit stuck on relevant stakeholders. And if you do find someone that can sort of walk it out there first, I'm not familiar enough with the LCE process, so I don't know if it would make sense to make one of those relevant stakeholders that does this, if that could be a private landowner. I think that might help you a lot in this particular part of the country, if that's relevant. But I'm also, I'm a public outreach specialist, and so one of the first questions I always have is, who are you concerned about? What might get in the way of you moving forward with these tools? Who's that audience? And what outreach do we need to do for them? Because I do think if you engage a couple of different projects and move them forward using these tools, that helps a lot, especially if we can design it around sort of those areas where you might have some concerns. Maybe you don't have any concerns.
No, that's a good point too. Yeah, like I said, we've got our list of people, like you guys have mentioned, and that's part of what we're working on next in the webinar here is kind of identifying who we're going to be working with. But yeah, I like all this feedback on taking it to a more concrete level and having someone to kind of demonstrate with. That makes a lot of sense for improving actual buy-in when we start doing doing the outreach to a kind of a broader audience.
Is your big concern here that no one will know about it or utilize it? Is that your biggest challenge, you think, or is there?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, so it's not like this is something that will alarm anybody. No one is going to look at this and say, oh, my land is within your mapped out area, and I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, you never know, but I don't think that's going to be a big problem. It's relatively general in a sense in the way it prioritizes things. So, I don't think it targets any, the highest level of prioritization we have for like habitat acquisition or protection is still just like 20% of the, available habitat of any given habitat. So that's covers a wide geography, it's a fair amount of land. So it's not going to, just single out like one or two landowners or something that would be like, oh, hey, that's my ranch, So hopefully that's not an issue. And while we did include things like parcel density, we don't actually have any information about specific parcels or anything in here. So there's nothing identifying any particular individuals or anything like that.
This is Tim Birdsong again. It's really a legitimate concern though, and it's been a concern for past LCC funded projects that we were involved with, and when we had some landowner based organizations that were sitting around the table in some early phases of the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC where we were generating all of these sorts of decision support tools and mapping products, and with a direction of, hey, these are priority areas for land acquisition, or these are priority areas for incentive-based habitat restoration, or something along those lines. And you have landowner groups that are sort of mixed on it. Some already play in the Farm Bill arena, and they say, oh, that's great that my property pops as within one of these priority areas, because that could lead to opportunities for me to partner with Farm Bill conservation delivery programs to implement things on this landscape. And then you've got another perspective that is, hey, my property's in this area that's a priority for land acquisition, and the government's going to come and take my land. and
Right.
Anyway, those sorts of concerns were expressed in past interactions with some of these landowner-based organizations. So I guess it depends on whether or not you envision that this tool is going to be something that's more used by conservation organizations, and it may be publicly available, but the way that it's kind of promoted, marketed, encouraged use of is more by conservation programs, state or federal or NGO, as compared to something that's going to be promoted out to private landowners, which I guess my sense is that it's probably not going to be, but there may be some landowner-based organizations that they get wind of it. Anyway, we've participated in other projects at a state level, like there's the WAFA Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, where there's a ranking and prioritization of the landscape, and you can make some efforts to try to get out in front of concerns and misinformation and misunderstandings about how that's going to be used. I don't necessarily think that should be a big focus here, because I think it seems like you're trying to get conservation programs to utilize this and not necessarily help landowners understand why they are or are not situated in a place that's viewed as a priority for something.
Right. Yeah, so I definitely think it's more, actual conservation organizations and agencies that we're targeting as far as the potential users of these products. Not, like you said, it is publicly available, though, so it's not like anyone can't just stumble across it if they're interested. And, we have involved people from NRCS and things like that, and that, do have a lot of these close connections and lots of different personnel, working in different arenas in terms of land management. So, I mean, there may be some connection, there's definitely connections to private landowners, and obviously there's an interest in promoting whatever level conservation professionals are working with landowners. But yeah, I'm not sure that I see landowner groups specifically being, thought of as a target audience in terms of using these products. But yeah, certainly it is a real issue. Do you have you were saying, there are things you can do to try and get ahead of this, but you didn't think you'd spend too much time worrying about that because it's not really our target audience. Are there some obvious steps you would suggest we take ahead of time just in case, or on that front, or?
Maybe some proactive talking points on information that's accessible. I think that's going to be there anyway, but what's the intent of this? What's it? Right. If it's pretty clearly stated what the purpose is and who's using it, then, and I think for TPWD programs, as an example, I mean, we often use the phrase, willing landowners, cooperative landowners. It's not, no one's being forced into cooperating on incentives or this, that, or the other in a place that we've selected as a priority. It's still fully contingent upon willing partners locally.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, thanks for all that. Does anyone else want to add to any of that, or have a comment about any of the other goals?
Hey, this is Jim Giacomo with the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture. I agree with what Tim was saying about making sure that you're clear what your audience is. For most of the tools that we build in the Oaks and Prairies, even the GRIP program and our staff that work on that stuff, they are working with the partner biologists, partner staff who are working with landowners. So we're one step away from, or at least one step away from directly working with landowners. And this is kind of a tool that those people can, the professionals can use to help target things, but having a thing to target is also important. You know, we kind of target our grassland restoration incentive program based on some models, and this one might be useful for part of that too. We'll have to see how it works out, but it's only for the northern half of the area. So the southern half is covered by the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, and they also have a grassland restoration incentive program, their Coastal GRIP program that's starting up, and this may be useful for them, especially depending on which variables you turn on or off.
Right.
But having a clear audience for what you want to talk about is really important, and you know, we, even in our partnership, not everyone that works with us understands that ultimately the customer is the landowner who's, you know, most of our conservation is going to be on private land, but the tools are not targeted to the customer. They're targeted to the people who are already working with landowners within the various partner organizations.
Right. All right. Anyone else? So I don't want to go over all of the individuals on the stakeholder list that I sent out in the webinar here. If you can just send me, if you have a minute to take a look at that spreadsheet I sent out in the last email, and if you can't find it, feel free to email me. I can send it to you again. But yeah, if you can take notes on that, who's missing, who's no longer relevant, things like that, and send that back to me, I'd really appreciate that. But I would like to take a moment to kind of look at least at the organization and agency level. That's a little less extensive of a list. So I was going to go through that real quick. And one thing I wanted to mention before that was, so in terms of prioritizing outreach, so one option is to, identify the organizations and agencies that we think need to be, targeted. And then the other is just have an open invitation when we send out the blueprint release. So if people are interested in having us come to them, that they can just request it. I think we'll probably do something a little bit of both. But I thought it'd be useful to kind of try to get some input on prioritizing who we should really be thinking about reaching out to if they don't automatically, contact us and respond to the email and all that. So I just use this as an example, just kind of ranking on a 1 to 4 the utility of a agency, the utility of these projects for an agency, and then also like the level of interest that already seems to exist there. I just kind of did this on a 1 to 4 scale. As an example here at Texas State, obviously we're very interested in the thing we're doing, but we're not actually delivering, conservation in any sense. So our utility for it would be lower because to the extent that we would use it, it would be more for informing future projects like this or the development of future things, or has a more of a research perspective than actually delivering conservation with it. So I don't know. Let's see. I'm going to open up the spreadsheet real quick, just to go through this real quick. So can everyone see this spreadsheet now instead of the PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right, so we'll try to go through this a little bit and see how this goes, and if it's not going great, we can skip it. But based off this list, and this is the same list of agencies that I emailed to anyone, I guess first we just start with, do you think there are any agencies that don't really, that were not included on here that you think we need to be thinking about? All right, I'll take that as a no for now. Feel free to email me at any point if you change your mind. So let's just go through this. Does anyone feel comfortable speaking to Altamont, Texas? What about Coastal Bend, Bays, and Estuaries program? Conservation Fund or Ducks Unlimited? What about the Edwards Aquifer Authority, or really any of the river authorities in general?
So you're asking us what would you like us to do? Sorry, I missed that part.
It's all right. Basically rank on a just 1 to 4
rank them. Okay.
objective scale. Do you think,
Got it.
like, what level of utility are these products to them, and how interested do you think they would be in using them? And those things may be exactly the same, but they may not be the same.
So for Edwards Aquifer Authority, I would say there may be a level of interest, maybe a 2 and a 2.
All right.
I would say across all the agencies that do some sort of watershed conservation, land conservation, restoration, preservation type work, I think the utility is pretty high. It's hard to speak to what other support tools that they already, have in place, and
right,
how this would fit into that. So it's easy to speak for our individual organizations, but right. Even I say that, but even like Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, we're a mega agency and fairly complex in different divisions and different programs, and some of those programs would have uses and some would not. But overall, I would say high utility, high interest. I would say the land trust community would be, I would say they would have, a high ranking for utility. There aren't many listed here, but there are
some that you would add.
I know I don't know if they're still active, but like the Pines and Prairie's Land Trust was active on the Lower Colorado. There are some other smaller kind of volunteer-based groups. I don't know if they're formal NGOs, but I wouldn't necessarily add them to this list right now. But there's like the Austin Bastrop River Corridor Partnership, and there are some other local conservation groups. The Texas River School has a river camp on the Lower Colorado River, and they're really interested in trying to use the entire Lower Colorado River as an area to get more of the public out on the river and engage in environmental stewardship and environmental education type initiatives. And so anyway, there are a lot of other smaller groups like that, or subcomponents within LCRA, like McKinney Ruffs Nature Park, and groups that might want to might be interested in cooperating on some sort of pilot project. But I think the organizations that have pots of funding that they're trying to allocate towards a lot of different restoration projects, like the Farm Bill delivery agencies, I think they're the ones that would be really interested. And so, USDA and RCS, I think would be a group that you might want to try to set up a presentation for the state NRCS staff, in the Temple office, or maybe give a presentation to the state, what is it called? The State Technical Advisory Committee. So all of the players that have influence over farm bill delivery, and, just promoting this as a tool that could help inform where those investments occur. But I know that some of these organizations like DU and the Nature Conservancy and others have, they put a lot of resources into developing their own decision support tools. So I'm not saying they wouldn't be interested. I think it's relevant. I just don't know what tools they're already using to make these kind of decisions.
Right, great. That was really, there's a lot there that, so one of the things I was actually going to ask about was exactly what you brought up there about the different subunits of some of these agencies, like Texas Parks and Wildlife is a good example, where you've got a lot of different levels, different offices, and people working on different things, and it's hard to just lump them all together as Texas Parks and Wildlife because they have different tools they're using and different goals, etc. I guess I'm just trying to decide if this is worth delving into here, or if I should just ask people to email me about it. But what individual subunits of, for example, Texas Parks and Wildlife, would you think are most likely to be interested in this?
Well, I think if you walk through the different components of your tool and you're saying, okay, what are the priority areas for acquisition, or priority areas for restoration, or this habitat type, that habitat type, it's different groups. And I could see we have a land conservation program that administers a conservation easement funding program. They would probably have some interest. There's a private lands program that in part manages our landowner incentive program, and they're constantly reevaluating priority areas statewide. We have, Cindy add to it but there may be other, in general, I know anything that has implications for river conservation, watershed conservation, Cindy's group's going to be interested. The group that I lead is going to be interested, and our water resources branch, our inland fisheries division, our coastal fisheries division is going to have interest. Our state parks division has its own natural resources program, and they have some interest. Those are just some examples. It's definitely not the complete list.
Right, and we can dig into this, outside of the webinar, of course, and look into this on our own. But I just thought it'd be nice to get some info while we're here. And you mentioned NRCS. I was hoping some of them would attend. Is anyone from NRCS on here? And I'm just not seeing their names. I don't think.
This is Scott Alford.
Oh yeah, Scott.
Yep.
I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that subject there of working with NRCS.
Yeah, I mean, we have like rangeland management specialists that I think would be interested in it. Probably the biologists as well. Each district conservationist. I think a lot of times it depends on where they're at and what they have going on there, depending on that person, is how far they would delve into it. But I think if you get, like I say, the specialists might be interested in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be great. I mean, that's obviously so much of the land in the geography is rangeland, and it's such a tricky thing to manage well in the first place. That those would be great people to be getting on with this. So. Yeah, there were a few other folks too that Salvador Salinas, and he invited a couple other people from the Temple office. Are you in Temple, Scott, or are you not in Temple?
No, and I don't deal a whole lot with the EQIP program and all that. I do mostly all coastal stuff. So Christy Oates, she's a state resource specialist.
Right. Yeah, she one of the people, Salvador.
Yeah.
The email.
Yeah, the ecological division. So she'd probably be the one to contact for sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, she is at least in our network at this point. I haven't talked to her yet, but yeah, good. And then we had some getting all that equip data. Obviously NRCS provided that, and people we talked to with that, they were really helpful. So that was really nice.
Right.
So,
okay. Good.
We've had some cooperation going on with NRCS at different levels. All right. Is there anyone from U.S. Fish on the call that would, has any subunits of U.S. Fish that think we should be highlighting for this outreach effort?
Brian, this is Nancy Brown. I'm happy to help follow up with you. Follow up on that with you later.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was just looking over the participant list. But do we have anyone? All right. Well, thanks. And Jim, I don't know if you want to talk about any of the joint ventures, or I guess they're pretty much already covered on this, and I'm not sure that there's subcomponents there or anything that's kind of under your purview that you'd like to add to this discussion. We lose you, Jim? All right, well, is anyone else, is there any other group on this list here that anyone would like to speak to directly? I know, it's already been said, it's kind of tough to speak to the needs of other agencies and organizations, but if you see your group on here and would like to add any comments about them, I'd appreciate that. Rich or Charlotte, you guys have anything to add to this?
No, I don't think we have anything to add at the moment.
All right. We'll go back to the PowerPoint. All right. Can everyone see the PowerPoint again?
Yes.
Thanks. So next is discussing our strategy for outreach. So our idea going into this was to do some targeted outreach, and basically the idea there is just having small in-person meetings where we travel to them and basically kind of run them through using these products and answering any questions they have, et cetera. Obviously, you can teach yourself all this with the documentation and everything, but it would be nice to have someone there to just make it a lot easier for people to learn how to use them more quickly and without having to expend a whole lot of effort on their part. So I guess a couple of the questions there are, and this is maybe something more we need to figure out moving forward after this webinar, really, instead of now. But I guess if anyone wants to just throw out real quick, if you think of organizations or groups that we could meet with jointly, or we're also thinking of kind of limiting this to 5 meetings and then having a couple of webinars or workshops afterwards that can kind of get at broader stakeholders. Of course, I really like the idea of trying to get a demonstration going with a particular group beforehand. I think that could definitely help with buy-in and all that, and we can figure that out moving forward. But in the meantime, just kind of thinking about the general plan here. Does anyone have any comments or inputs on that? I'll add the other thing here. We've also got webinars versus workshops. So beyond the targeted outreach that we do in person, I'm leaning more towards just hosting a couple of webinars. I think that's easier for everyone. Just kind of drop into one of these webinars and see how the products are used, rather than hosting a full-on workshop, since we are doing the in-person small meetings. But does anyone have any input on this general approach? All right.
I think that this has been a struggle for like every LCC project that I remember being supported. It's just, developed a lot of really great products that conceptually, lots of great application there, but trying to transition those products and forming some conservation decision when a lot of our field staff that are delivering those programs, they already have a full plate, they already have an approach, they already have a set of priorities, they're delivering. And so to try to bring in another tool to help inform them, that's why I suggested that pilot effort earlier, because I think that you really have to have someone on a conservation delivery end bought into using it almost before it's developed. And we're at a point now where I think, Fish and Wildlife Service funded this, so I don't know if there's an opportunity to try to work with James Braska to, have him help bridge a gap there, build a relationship with like a Fish and Wildlife Service partners program, or maybe their fisheries program or their coastal program, or some group where you could kind of demo use of the tool. But because I think you can spend a lot of time going around to these meetings, and those agencies will all identify someone that's welcome, that will be welcoming and happy to have you there and listen and brainstorm potential uses. And you could get, I mentioned like our land conservation program. I mean, you could meet with the land conservation program at TPWD, and I think they would be interested. But when the next RFP is being developed, it's the nuts and bolts of how does this tool get incorporated into scoring criteria for an RFP, or how to some step in the process where it gets formalized where this is going to be used. Otherwise, business kind of continues as usual. Right.
No, that's a really great point. I'm glad to hear more on that. That's it's a really big deal. And like you said, reaching out to James is probably a first option there. So got some ideas for who all to reach out to. So definitely appreciate this input, because we want to make sure, I could definitely see it going the way you say, where we go out there and everyone's real nice and it sounds great, but then, because of the formalities and technicalities and everything, it's tough to actually have people end up using it in the end.
Yeah, and I think now that, this was funded by Gulf Coast Prairie LCC, correct?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so now that the LCCs are in, some of those have been completely disbanded, some have kind of transitioned into some other sort of partnership focused group. But yeah, they're all different than they were. And previously, those partners are sitting on a steering committee and science teams and other sorts of working groups, and you would have been able to, go to an LCC meeting and have that as a venue to demo this, and there would have been more of a formal discussion among the steering committee members of, hey, what organizations, what programs can work with to put this to use, and let's track that over some time frame, because we're wanting to develop applied products here. And so with the LCC gone, I think now you're looking at your funder as more of the science applications program of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to throw James under the bus, but I think I would really lean on James to help identify some of those programs that can put this to use.
Right. Makes sense. Thank you for that. Does anything else you or anyone else wants to add?
This is Nancy. I feel strongly about, I'm completely in agreement. I think that's a really smart approach just from an outreach perspective, because I think that will affect ultimately how you do conduct your outreach. If you have someone that can speak to how they've used that tool, then that, I think, changes how you would communicate moving forward. So I think that's a really good idea. And Brian, as you know, I'm happy to help with all of that.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything? Pretty close to wrapping this up. One more slide, I think. All right, so yeah, last is the outreach materials. So the first thing is just having a formal website that people can check out. Have our final LCD report, a link to the database, the products on databasin, documentation, an FAQ, a fact sheet, a virtual walkthrough, so that if people aren't able to, come to one of our outreach meetings or webinars or something like that, they can still watch a walkthrough. Contact information. Is there anything else that anyone just off the top of your head you'd think is missing there that needs to be on our website? We felt like that pretty much covered it, but just in case someone has a great idea, wanted to open that up. All right, so the virtual walkthrough, and again, the whole thing about, working directly with someone to kind of demo this kind of changes the tone of a lot of what we're talking about here. Not trying to ignore that in any sense, but we do currently have a virtual walkthrough. It's just a recording of me going through and showing people how to use everything and what everything means, how it works. That's up on YouTube right now. It's using the draft version of the products, and we released that when we did the draft review. So that needs to be re-recorded with the new products to be updated. But I'll send out a link to everyone so that, if you have the time and feel like doing it, I think it's fairly short, like 15 minutes maybe. If you'd have the time to kind of watch that and provide any feedback, that would be helpful. And yeah, then we'll be working on a fact sheet and FAQ, and that will probably, we already have ideas for that, but and then it'll probably further be informed based on how things work out with talking with a demonstration partner. So that's basically it. Are there any things else that people want to add in terms of outreach materials? Do you think we're missing anything here? All right, well, that wraps it up. So if anyone has any last comments or questions, I really appreciate all the feedback. We have links here to the conservation blueprint itself on databasin, the draft documentation, and the original planning site. It's kind of messy, that's why we're working on a new site. And then my contact information there if you have any questions for me. But yeah, if anyone has any last comments or questions before we wrap this up. All right. Well, thank you all for participating. I really appreciate it. I feel like this is really helpful and will help steer us in the right direction and make sure that this outreach page is a success. So thanks again, and I'll probably be talking to you again soon.